Well, if you look around, you may notice this is not the same location as last week. Funny thing happened. About 5 minutes from finishing the lecture last week on Sunday, Robert Brewer and I realized that we forgot to hit record for the lecture. And so here I'm coming to you from my home, recording the lecture. There's no one here except me and my dog. So if you hear some barking a little into this lecture, it might be me, it might be the dog, but it's no one else. Despite having to re-record this lecture, I'm glad you're here if you're watching online. We had a small group on Sunday because of storms, so there's a good chance you might be watching online this week. And if you are, thanks for coming back. I hope you enjoyed last week's beginning of the series, and this week will be a little different. You know, from the lecture last week, the thing that I found people were most energized about and most excited about to discuss was the corruption of the Catholic Church and the popes. I had a lot of questions after class about it. And I think partially because there's something about the corruption, and it's so long ago that it really spurs the imagination. It's something funny to think about removed from the situation. You know, there was so much, you know, the priests becoming millionaires. Anything they say automatically goes out to millions of people. It gets to the point where you're not really allowed to question the Pope or religious leaders. There were popes having extramarital affairs. Well, they weren't supposed to be married, so any sexual relation was not ordained, but you have them having sexual relations, often with minors. This just amount of money they're stealing from the poor, and having the equivalent of hundreds of millions of dollars. There's some of this that really captured people's imagination. And you could be forgiven if you thought I was referring to televangelists today when describing the popes in the Catholic Church of years ago. I mention all this and comparing it to the televangelists because someone asked me, you know, this is really great information. I haven't heard a lot of it before. It's really got me thinking, what do I do with it? Right? I mean, this historical knowledge is great, but really, what do you do with it? And so here's my response to that. Whenever you hear something new through this series, think about, where do I fit into this? Where have I seen this in my life? What beliefs being discussed do I agree with or disagree with? What things, even though we're talking about historical issues, sound familiar in today's context? I think you'll get the most out of this asking yourself those questions. And so with that, let's recap last week. So we had the power of the Catholic Church last week and its belief systems with St. Augustine, and it grew to be so powerful it became corrupt. Watched a little video on the corrupt popes, which led to opposition to Catholic beliefs from Catholics and opposition to the popes. That brings us Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation. And from there, we get the spread of Protestantism across Europe. The image on the left is the one that we ended with last week. That was the Puritans in the Bay of New Amsterdam, leaving for the New World, the Pilgrims boarding the Mayflower. When they were going to this new land, they thought of it as the New Jerusalem. They were the new Adam and Eve in some way, leaving the heretical actions of all of Europe. They were bringing the true religion to this wilderness far removed. The image on the right is a painting of the Pilgrims arriving to Plymouth Rock, Massachusetts. And that's where we'll begin. It's important to note When looking at these images and discussing their story, they were not the first here. Just from a colony standpoint, Roanoke started in 1583. It was a complete failure. Jamestown started in 1616. Religion was not a focus. In fact, it was an afterthought that religion really never took off in Jamestown. All of Mexico, what we think of as Mexico and Florida, was colonized by Spain, which was Catholic. So all of the southern hemisphere was Catholic. Most importantly, Native Americans were here. Depending on where you were in this country, they had been here between 8,000 and 14,000 years. And between all the various different tribes, you had hundreds, if not thousands, of different religious traditions, religious understandings, different views of a different God that sometimes looked like the Christian God, sometimes didn't. So you have a wide variety of beliefs. A combination of this fact with the fact that they were in a place that had vast space, no religious connections to Europe, no regulation, and the Puritans bringing with them beliefs that were already new. This would come to define the next 150 years of Christianity in this country. We'll also find questions being asked that we continue to ask ourselves today, and I'll bring up a few examples throughout this class today. Perhaps the best way to think of it, as I mentioned last week, what we begin to find here is a new people, a new country on how they understand an old God. So with it, we'll get to the Puritans. I think there's a common belief in America when we talk about the Pilgrims that, oh, they came here for religious freedom. And to some degree, this is true. I think it's a lot like saying, she got her looks from her mother, and forgetting to mention that her mother's a plastic surgeon. Yes, in some sense it's true, but there's a lot more to the story. The Puritans came here for religious freedom. They did not believe in religious freedom themselves. In fact, they were strong advocates of religious intolerance. They just believed they were on the wrong side of it. The persecution they were facing, they would have been very happy to persecute the others, but they were in the minority, and so they came here. So here's a sermon from an early Puritan minister. So that thus it is the natural men are held in the hand of God over the pit of hell. They have deserved the fiery pit and are already sentenced to it. And God is dreadfully provoked. His anger is as great towards them as to those who are actually suffering the executions of the fierceness of his wrath in hell. And they have done nothing in the least to appease or abate that anger. Neither is God in the least bound by any promise to hold them up in one moment, and the devil is waiting for them. Hell is gaping for them. The flames gather and flash about them, and they would fain lay hold on them and swallow them up. The fire pent up in their own hearts is struggling to break out, and they have no interest in any mediator. There are no means within reach that can be any security to them. In short, they have no refuge, nothing to take a hold of. All that preserves them every moment is the mere arbitrary will and uncoveted, unobligated forbearance of an incensed God. We are sinners in the hands of an angry God. My God, what a message. I think you get a good sense of their understanding of God and their religion from this sermon. We are sinners in the hands of an angry God. God is rightfully angry at us. We're all doomed to hell. God's always going to be angry with us. So how do we relate to a God, and how do we relate to this world? We'll start with their theology. What is it they believe? They believe in a concept called predestination, which many Christians still believe in today. It comes from Romans chapter 8, verses 28 through 30. And the idea is, before we're ever born, before we're ever created, God has decided who is among the elect. who is going to heaven and who is not. This is something we ourselves don't even know, but God knows it. Um, and that frames a funny way of how do you practice your religion. Part of the theology as well, once they come to America, they coined the phrase American exceptionalism. Uh, we are bringing the true religion here to this wilderness. The Native Americans don't count. We're forming a new covenant with God. We are an exceptional people because of this. And God has ordained this and blessed this new world that we're in, that anything we do is right because of our commitment to the quote unquote true religion. So the predestination thing comes back into play. If you are predestined, what do you do in your community? Well, you have to have personal piety. You have a personal relationship with God, and now you have a personal piety. That part of this is proving to your neighbors that you are probably of the elect. Your actions say that of course you're not going to hell. You can't be of any suspicion, so you can't miss church service. You can't wear the wrong thing. You can't say the wrong thing. Religion comes an awful lot about proving to your community that you're one of the good ones. Another thing that you might hear nowadays that they came up with is, if things are bad in your life, your sin has caused that. Here's an example they would use. If you are poor, God has willed it, and because likely you have not worked hard enough. I think we still hear that quite a bit today. What are some more of their beliefs? One question comes to mind for them. If each person has a personal relationship with God, when we sin, do we bring punishment for the whole community? This might be a good question to pause and think about for a moment for yourself. When we sin personally, is sin introduced to the whole community? We had a good conversation about this in class. Half said yes and half said no. Here's what I say, going back to how do you interpret this history, here's a modern example of this question, without saying one thing or another. If you define sin as injustice, as many people do, if you look at an organization like Black Lives Matter, for example, many in that organization would argue when someone commits an injustice, it taints the whole community. Even if you did not commit the injustice yourself, you stood by to let it happen. This is essentially a Puritan argument. If you bring sin into a community, even if you didn't do it and you sat by and let it happen, it has tainted the whole community. So here's a way where it shows back up again in modern life. So what do you do to prevent sin being introduced to a community? Well, you do harsh punishments. You see on the slide here, public shaming if you break the law. And boy, they really go far with that. There's a famous book called The Scarlet Letter. If you committed adultery for the rest of your life, they would have put a scarlet A across your chest on all of your clothing. So everyone knew for the rest of your life you committed adultery once, and you were never allowed to commune with the community again. People were put in stocks and thrown in prison. They bring corporal punishment to the New World. The first to do so. For women in particular, boy, they got the rough end of this. One of the things was often done to women was called dunkings. They would be tied to a chair and held underwater until they almost drowned, brought back up to breathe, and then dunked again. And this would go on for hours in some cases. And ultimately, if none of this chases someone off the wrong path, you had burnings and hangings as well. With everything that's been said, they also bring in some legacy beliefs into America that I think are very good. There's my opinion. One of the first things for the United States government, they bring the Mayflower Compact with them. The first group of people that said, because they do believe in equality, despite the harshness, they do believe in a sense of equality. So when they arrived to America, they all sent a document. I have a picture of it right here. They each come up with the laws together. They say, here's our laws, here's what we all agree to follow. And they all sign it saying the governed are allowed to govern themselves. This is a huge deal. John Adams goes on to say, this is directly leads to the Constitution of the United States. The next is, because we have a personal relationship with God and a right to personally think, education is a right. They found Yale University because people ought to be able to give, to think and grow how they think. But as maybe not a surprise, not everyone's happy in this community. In fact, if you read the diaries of people at the time, everyone was miserable. This was really an awful place to live. And so you start getting growing opposition. I'm going to mention 3 examples quickly. The first is Ann Hutchinson. Reverend John Cotton is appointed the minister in Massachusetts. He comes out and says, you know what, I believe in predestination, but I believe there are some extraordinary examples in which God may give grace, and people who are not of the elect might still go to heaven. And Hutchinson begins a Bible study in her home, and she takes the idea and runs with it and says, you know what, predestination doesn't exist at all. She gains a mass following in the Massachusetts Bay area. People really like what she has to say. She's put on trial because she is going against the teachings of the church. They are about to execute, and they say, no, 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 we'll excommunicate her. There's that Catholic word from last week coming back. She is banished from the community into the wilderness with the thought that she'll probably die out there. We'll get back to her in a second. Mary Dyer is a contemporary of hers. She likes Ann Hutchinson, agrees with their views. Her and her husband, William, are strong advocates in the Boston area for her beliefs. But once Ann Hutchinson's kicked out of the community, the Puritan leaders panic and say, this huge sin has been introduced, almost broke apart our community. We have to double down on our rules. And so they double down on their laws. One of the really unfortunate things that happen is looking for signs from God of sin being introduced. And one of their beliefs is if a woman has a miscarriage or has a child that is disabled in any capacity, that's a sign that they're working with the devil. Really unfortunately for Mary Dyer, she's already gotten in trouble for supporting Ann Hutchinson. Her and her husband has. Right after this incident, she gives birth to a stillborn child who is severely physically deformed. Word of this gets around. Word starts coming back that she might be executed for working with the devil. Her and her husband flee on a boat to England to escape. While she's in England, she converts to the Quaker belief system. And it's really an interesting system. The Quakers believe that all of us have the inner light of Christ. So because of that, they don't believe in baptism because we already have the inner light. They don't believe in formal prayer or communion. They don't believe in ordained ministry because we've already been ordained by God. All people were born ministers, men and women. And because of these beliefs, the Quakers were looked at as the #1 heretics, according to the Puritans. After 5 years, the Dyers come back. They are arrested, and ultimately, Mary Dyer is executed in 1660 with several other Quakers. Many other are tortured and maimed for being heretics in Boston. I had someone last week after class say, you know, with all that Catholic corruption, and I know Protestants aren't perfect, but at least we never killed people that way. Sorry to tell you, but yes, we did. Perhaps the most famous example of this, and the climax of this fierce persecution of anyone who was thought of as heretical, came in the Salem witch trials, which you may have heard about in 1693. Salem witch trials, 19 people were executed. Over 80 were accused of doing witchcraft, and 40 odd confessed to doing it. This is a embarrassment, probably an understatement for the leaders. There came a point where they realized what was happening in the trials wasn't true. At first, they believed, yes, these people signed the devil's book, sold their soul to the devil. An 11-year-old girl started having seizures, which could have been a sign that she was working with the devil. Immediately came out and said, no, I had the seizure because someone in the community signed the book of the devil. The devil came to me and I refused to sign it, but the devil showed me the book. And there it went. We still don't know what happened exactly, but dozens of mostly teenage girls got together, all having mass hallucinations, all agreeing with the same story, and they just kept accusing more and more and more people. So how did the trials end? A lot of suspicion came to their stories when they accused a 4-year-old girl of signing a deal with the devil, and ultimately when they accused the chief minister over the trials of signing the book. I guess that's when their stomach dropped and they realized all this has been fake. And you can't unexecute 19 people. And you really begin to see a down, the colony never recovers in the same Puritan way from there. It's just downhill from there. People flee, people are grieving, no one wants the beliefs anymore, and you just see a downfall from that point. I have a clip here of the trials. This comes from the movie The Crucible. I got it off of YouTube. One of the great things about the trial, they wrote almost word for word everything that was said and done. So here's a group of the girls claiming the devil is flying above them to attack them as they're accusing another 10 or 11-year-old girl of signing the book of the devil. So you can see how fervent the people came in their beliefs, and people believed it almost till the end. From this, just like the Catholic Church in the formation of the Protestants, you see an actual opposition and counter to the Puritan beliefs in Roger Williams. Roger Williams was a Puritan, also friends with Anne Hutchinson. He grew up in England. He was born in 1603, and while in England, he saw the wars between the Catholics and Protestants, and thousands of Christians be slaughtered in these, with governments taking sides and torturing people and killing people. And he couldn't understand this. He said, this is not the actions of Christ who we claim to follow. This view was only doubled when he came to America, and he saw the Puritans gathering the Narragansett Bay Native Americans and killing them for refusing to convert, and the king signing over their land to the Puritans. And he just couldn't grasp this idea. He said the goal of the church is to live as closely to the Bible and the life of Jesus as humanly possible. And Jesus did not persecute. God also gave us personal conscience and the ability to think, which means we all have the right to have different views and understandings. God reveals God's self to us through our personal thoughts, through our ability to reason and think and to have logic. That people can come to different conclusions, and that's okay, because somewhere in there, God's in the work in all of it. He said openly in 1635, "We, the Puritans in Massachusetts, have not our land by patent from the king, but that the natives are the true owners of it by natural law." So he takes it a step further. Government has a responsibility in this, not to take sides in which religion's correct, but to guarantee that all people have rights, including the minority view. In this case, the Narragansett Native Americans. I said I'd come back to Anne Hutchinson. When she's excommunicated from the community, she finds Roger Williams' colony. Roger Williams leaves Massachusetts and forms the Rhode Island colony, the first place in the New World founded on both religious freedom and religious tolerance. Here's two quotes I like from Roger Williams. In a letter to the governor of the Massachusetts colony, he wrote, "I feel safer down here among the Christian savages along the Narragansett Bay than I do among the savage Christians in your own colony. It is impossible to persecute without killing many Jesus Christ along the way." That's really something to think about, isn't it? So another question you might want to ask yourself, and maybe pause for a moment and reflect on, what does it mean to be tolerant? So now we have different colonies, different religious beliefs, immigrants coming and changing the landscape of the land. And what we get from that is the emergence of things called denominations. I have two charts here on the screen. On the left is immigration breakdown. All the different colors are different regions of Europe where people are coming. So you have the French, the Dutch, Africans because of the slave trade, Scotch-Irish, Germans and Scots, the English, and there's more that's not mentioned. On the right side, you see the religious diversity forming at the same time. And this is just the leading Christian denominations and ideas forming. You have the Catholics are still here. It doesn't color in Florida because it wasn't part of the colonies, but Florida would have been all red. You have the Quakers and Baptists, the Puritans. North Carolina was largely Anglican. It was required to be Anglican, not always followed. You have the Moravians. It also doesn't show Jewish populations. Savannah, Georgia would have had a large Jewish population, also in New Jersey. So why do denominations form? I think that's a question many of us are battling with today. What's the point in an organized religion around denomination? So what are the reasons they form? First, getting back to pietism and the Puritans, we each have personal spirituality. Each person is responsible for their own salvation. Because we don't know who is of the elect, we must be very critical of our neighbors, because someone might usher in sin. A denomination is a good way to say very directly, here's what the belief system is, and also it's a good structure to make sure people don't get out of line. The next reason is people for the first time can be sectarian. You actually have the option of other for the first time in Christianity. So because you can choose other or nothing, you have to justify your beliefs for the first time. That's never really had to be done. And there's now competition from different belief systems, and damnation is on the line, they would believe. So they have to justify their beliefs. A denomination and that type of structure is a good way to do that. The next, and boy, the church of today is getting a taste of this, missional. You can no longer wait for people to come to you because it's not required by law. So now you must reach out to other people. Man, we're getting a taste of this today. A denomination is a good way to reach out to people. That structure is a good way. And the last is revivalism. We'll get to this on the next slide, but there's a belief that America in this time was a deeply spiritual, religious place. It wasn't true. We'll get here. I'm going to go to the next slide for a second. Only 10 to 30% of church attendance in the colonies. In North Carolina in 1780, only 3% of North Carolinians attended church. Wow. So we were not a Christian nation, which was a panic to religious people, because we are American exceptionalism. We are here of the chosen people from God to restart this true religion, and none of the people are attending church. That's a huge conflict in belief, and we have to do something about it. So we need revivalism to bring people back, not just to your denomination, but into Christianity. And a way of demonstrating your personal piety is also through revivalism. They do that through the camp meeting. We'll get to that in a minute. So those are the backgrounds of why denominations form. So what are some of the early denominations? I've mentioned the Quakers briefly earlier. They are the furthest outlier of the denominations field, the most unlike the rest, I would argue. They believe deeply in modesty and humbleness on top of the things I mentioned earlier. Belief in tolerance. They believe that you communicate to God through silence. God speaks to us through silence, so there's a great emphasis on it. They believe in quorum. We each have independent thought, but God does not lie. So if there's 8 Quakers in a room, they need to make a decision. They sit there until they all have the same, someone can propose an idea, and they sit there until everyone's 100% in agreement, because God's going to get you to the truth. Also, they form a spiritual practice called clearness committees. I've seen people do clearness committees who've never done them before, and they say, this is the best spiritual practice I've ever done in my life. I knew someone of the Pentecostal background who went through a clearness committee and converted to the Quaker religion because of how impactful it was in their life. In the clearness committee, it's a beautiful structure. Quakers don't believe in members, so everyone just calls themselves friends. So you call your closest friends to a meeting. They sit in a circle around you. There can be 4 or 5 or 8 or 10, and you describe in great detail what your crisis is. What are you struggling with? What is ripping your heart out? What can you not figure out in your life? And you explain in great detail. Your friends are only allowed to ask you clarifying questions. They ask you a question, you respond to it. Another person asks you a question, you respond to it. And this can go back and forth for an hour or two. At the end of the session, everyone reads back. They've been taking notes. They read back your own words to you. Here's what you said to this. The idea being God is within you, the inner light. It is guiding you to the truth, that through hearing back what you're already saying, you will find your right path. And it's amazing to see how they transform through this process. The Anglicans, they are essentially the Church of England outside of England. And North Carolina was an Anglican colony. I mentioned Church of England last week, so I won't go into great detail this week. The next are the Presbyterians. We have a Presbyterian gentleman in our class, so I want to especially point this out for him. They have a 5-point plan, we'll call it, on the foundation of their beliefs. And you can break it down with the acronym of TULIP. The T stands for total depravity. Our lack of merits prevent us from receiving salvation. U, unconditional election. No difference separates the elect from the reprobate, those who's going to hell. Only gracious, unmerited favor from God. L, limited atonement. Only the elect are saved by the cross. Jesus did not die for everybody. Irresistible grace. The elected may turn away from grace for a while, but the power of it will bring them back, and this is called saving grace. Saving grace is infused in your soul, and though you may stray, will always bring you back to the fold of God. Finally, P, perseverance of the saints. The elected are sustained by God in a state of grace. This keeps salvation in their soul, so they are unable to turn away from God completely. So that's TULIP in the Presbyterians. You see a huge counter to that, to the early Baptists in America. They call themselves at this time the Arminians. They disagree on almost every point of the Presbyterians. Number one, they believe in a 5-point plan as well. Number one, humans are biased towards sin, but have free will. The human race did not inherit original sin, so we are capable of doing good. Huge break from the Puritans, huge break from St. Augustine and the Catholics. Number two, all persons can be elected based on repentance and faith. We have a choice in the matter. The only thing God's asking is for you to have faith and belief. Number three, Christ's atonement is for all. We're going to get to that word atonement in a little bit. Christ's atonement is for all, but only believers fully have it. So all persons' salvation is possible because Christ died for everyone. God will reach 99% towards you, but you must reach 1% back towards God. Number four, grace is not irresistible, but it is indispensable for spirituality and salvation. God's saving grace cooperates with the will of humans who believe. We can choose to not follow God and go in a different direction. There's nothing that will pull us back automatically. And five, the Holy Spirit and the grace of it conquers evil in this world. So quite a bit of difference from the Presbyterians. Methodists we'll talk about in 2 weeks. And for the folks in the Winston area, there's the Moravians who founded Salem. We'll also discuss them in 2 weeks. So now that you have denominations, you have these very clearly different religious beliefs. What happens? As we mentioned, not many people are religious for many reasons. There's also a development of different ideas what it means to be a Christian. We still have a lot of debate about that today. But what begins to happen is something called the Great Awakening. In the 1720s in New England, Christians agreed that to be Christian, you had to have had a religious experience. If you don't have a religious experience, well, we're not so different from the Catholics. Where we're talking about the Catholic belief being a communal belief, you're born into it. So if you don't have a religious conversion experience, you're not really Christian. Most American Christians would say at the time. What begins to happen, very early Christians believe that, particularly the Puritans, after they're here a couple generations, their grandchildren are born into the church. So this causes a great panic. On top of that, Jonathan Edwards, whose sermon I read you earlier, and other ministers began to note this out of his diary, religion had reached a time of extraordinary dullness. Nothing was changing or adapting, even though life and the understanding in the New World was. So Edwards began delivering a series of sermons about faith addressing these issues. And when he was preaching in Boston, something he couldn't explain happened. A fervor descended upon the congregation who, in Puritan practices, were required to stay silent. And all of a sudden, people began to weep and fall to the floor. Some fainted, some laughed and danced hysterically. As he was preaching, he couldn't understand what was happening, and he came to the conclusion, God has reached out and touched this congregation and has awakened them to the glory of God. Thus begins a movement called the Great Awakening. To begin with, what is an awakening? Here's a definition. It typically embodies the romantic elements of religion: adventure, quest, mysticism, intuition, wonder, experience, nature, unity, historical imagination, art, and music against religious convention. All of these things against what's always been done. That's an awakening. So now that you have an awakening, this event in Boston that word spreads out about, people want to copy this event. How can you take what happened in Boston and spread it across the country? Also, what did conversion consist of? You're now required to have a conversion experience, an experience with God to be Christian. What does that mean? There's lots of ideas. People begin to define it. A sense of dependence on God's sovereign power, terror over one's lost condition, recognition of God's righteous justice in condemning sinners, realization that God is gracious. All these things are a type of conversion. What happens as the awakening forms and as people begin to convert, a real understanding of faith that's still largely held in America today. Religion is a sense of the heart. It's not something you can grab. It's not something by writing about it you have. It's not something you can just think about and have. It's not something you can just go and say a prayer and have. It is something that's inexplicable, unexplainable, and deeply rooted in your heart. Another huge break from the religious traditions 200 years before that. Religion is a sense of the heart, so says Jonathan Edwards. So the Great Awakening has happened in Boston. How do you spread this to the rest of the colonies? They do this through the camp meeting. A camp meeting is a method of producing an awakening. The awakening is the spiritual practice. The camp meeting helps you get there. Here's a quote from a camp meeting of someone who attended one. Sinners dropping down on every hand, shrieking and groaning, crying for mercy, convoluted professors of religion praising and agonizing, fainting and falling down in distress, for sinners or in the raptures of joy, some singing, some shouting, some clapping their hands, hugging and even kissing, laughing, others talking to the distressed, to one another or to the opposers of the work, and all this at once. No spectacle can excite a stronger sensation. This was written by 16-year-old Peter Cartwright from North Carolina. He converted to Christianity at the Cane Ridge camp meeting and became the first American-born Methodist powerhouse minister. So camp meetings produce an awakening. They were began by the Presbyterians, particularly James McGreedy out of Guilford County. He wanted to take Jonathan Edwards' experience and replicate it. And what he thought the best way to replicate it is to move away from an emphasis on conversion to an emphasis on what he called regeneration, which is proof that you've accepted God's grace. Earlier on, it was all about having a conversion. That's now just assumed at this point. How do you prove that you have converted? That's regeneration. So the camp meeting brought in dozens of religious leaders. And I think one of the high points of American Christianity, denominations are forming, but they say we have great differences, but we can put them aside for this common goal of converting people to the faith. So you'll have Presbyterians and Quakers and Methodists and all different denominations assembled together with their ministers represented preaching. And these camp meetings, you have to realize what a miracle they would have seemed to be. They lasted for days. Cane Ridge in 1801, 30,000 people attended Cane Ridge, and it lasted for 3 days. If put yourself in you're someone from Kentucky in the backwoods. At that time, most Americans in their whole life never went further than 15 miles away from their home. So you have that. You're working your farm, you have a vast area, you might not see people but once every couple months, going to a general store, seeing a neighbor going by the road. You had very limited access to your community. But word begins to come to you that, oh, there's this traveling thing coming. They're talking about Christianity, which you probably know about, even if you don't attend a church. You know about this religion thing, and they're coming and they're inviting you to come, and you go, and 30,000 people are there. Wow, that's got to be a miracle. And if you think about it, this isn't so different from the Jesus feeding the masses the fish and loaves. Because while they're there for 3 days, food's produced. People bring their food with them to share, to keep the event going. This feels like a miracle. So it's no wonder people convert in mass droves. Most conversions in America stem from the camp meetings from the Great Awakening. Wow. Why is this important? One, today the camp meeting is called a revival. Every revival movement you've ever heard of has been an attempt to replicate the camp meeting from the Great Awakening. Everything Billy Graham did was an attempt to copy the camp meeting. In the modern times, he's probably the most successful at trying to replicate the camp meeting. They're not great on theology, but it's great on experience. Leading people to the door, and then you leave, and they need to take care of the rest. Denominations fill that for you. That's an important reason. It becomes part of the American mythology. Every revival movement today's based off of it. It becomes built into our story and our DNA. Also, for the Puritans, you say American exceptionalism. Here's the proof of American exceptionalism. God has awakened our people in a way never that happened in Europe. There's the proof. God's going to be with us and protect us for eternity because of this event. So they say. Also, another big thing, it is the very first unifying experience in the colonies. Up to this point, the colonies were loosely held together, largely didn't like each other. They were each governed by different countries or by themselves. Not much brought them together. There was no language, no history, no background. But now, this thing that began in Boston spread to New Hampshire and Connecticut and Rhode Island and Virginia and North Carolina and Georgia. And all of a sudden, many, if not most Americans claim we have had the same experience, if not, in many cases, heard the same minister. Americans don't begin to think of themselves as an America at this point, but they begin to say, we have things that bind us together. This is really important during the American Revolution. Because of this, you have the flip side. For the first time, cultural wars come to America. As the camp meeting era is winding down, you really start to get divisions in denominations and who was right and who was wrong. So what are the unintended consequences of the camp meeting? There are a few. At these meetings, all different people of all different backgrounds came together. You had rich and poor. You had men and women working together in ways they wouldn't typically do. You have black and white coming together. Everyone was welcome to these experiences. You have free and slave coming together or working together in these experiences. Does that impact your religious belief? Of course it does. Right? This hadn't happened yet before. Now we're all together in a group sharing an experience, and seeing your neighbor go through that same experience, the same way you do. Wow, how do you process that? You also have women who might not be allowed to preach, but they can testify, which is essentially preaching, and they do so very brilliantly in this era. So now, not only are you with people you normally wouldn't be, but now people are preaching to you who normally wouldn't be, who very well might even convert you. Black ministers can preach at these meetings to largely white audiences. So think of yourself in this time at a camp meeting. You're a white person. A black person gets up behind a pulpit and preaches, and you were converted by that experience. You believe in slavery. What does that say about your belief and your understanding of religion and the laws of this country? We'll double that. Jarena Lee comes down south. A black woman converts you as a white person. What does that say about your belief in that moment? Maybe you don't know, but you have a reckoning with the reality of your life and this experience you just went through. This is one of the biggest outcomes of the camp meeting. It was completely unattended. What do we do with this belief of slavery in the United States? Women's rights too, but to a lesser extent at this moment. And so what you begin to see is American Christians coming to a reckoning moment with the original sin of America, slavery. You also have black individuals who attended these meetings saying, I was allowed to mingle in these groups. I converted in these experiences. White people hugged me and helped me. I hugged and helped them. I fed them. Why am I a slave? They would have been thinking, why are they a slave, for long before this and after this. But this adds a new depth and layer to it. So next week, we will get to slavery and Christianity. We'll start with the beginnings of slavery, and we'll get through after Reconstruction to the turn of the century, how the Christians responded to slavery on both sides, how did Black Christian thought develop from this experience, and the emergence of Black denominations and Black religious thought. We'll get to that next week. I'm going to post a video later on of Robert Brewer going over the theology for this week. So I'll post 2 videos on this segment. Reverend Brewer's will be posted today or tomorrow. So I'm going to skip over his slides for a moment and get to the final thought of the week. God is too large to be housed under one roof. Roger Williams. How fitting after discussion on denominations and ending with the camp meeting and experiences bringing people who normally wouldn't be together. I'm going to leave you with a lingering question that I hope you think about over the next week. Does religion separate us or bring us together? That's a tough question. But give it a thought this week. Does religion separate us or bring us together? I'm glad you could be here this week, and I look forward to seeing you next week. God bless.